Elena Vasquez stood at the center of the great chamber, looking up at the thousands of alien faces watching her. The Galactic Harmony Chamber was bigger than any building on Earth, floating in space around a dead star that gave off strange light. She had been coming here for 20 years, but today felt different. Today was the last time she would speak for humanity. The chamber was alive with colors and sounds from hundreds of different worlds. The crystal people from Zephyr glowed blue when they were worried, and right now they were very blue indeed. The gas clouds from the nebula world swirled faster when they were upset, and Elena could see them spinning like angry storms. Even the bug-like apex colonies were clicking their claws in ways that meant they were scared. "Friends," Elena said, and her voice carried to every corner of the massive room through technology she barely understood. "I come before you today with heavy news. After 200 years of working together, humanity must step back from galactic politics." A sound like thunder rolled through the chamber. It was the sound of nearly 1,000 different species all trying to talk at once. Elena held up her hand and waited for quiet. The first to speak was Ambassador Keth from the Thermal Lords. His body was made of living metal that glowed red-hot. And when he was angry, which was often, he got even hotter. Right now he was almost white with heat. "This cannot be." Keth's voice sounded like molten steel being poured. "Humans are the only ones who can make sense when the rest of us argue. Without you, how will we settle our differences?" Elena had expected this question. She had been dreading it for months. "You will find a way. You are all intelligent species. You managed to travel between stars and build this amazing place. You can learn to talk to each other." But even as she said it, Elena knew it wasn't true. Humans had a special gift that they had never fully explained to the other species. They could understand alien ways of thinking that should have been impossible to understand. When the crystal singers spoke in colors and the void dancers communicated through tiny changes in gravity, humans somehow knew what they meant. Queen Zara of the hive minds buzzed with a sound like a million bees. "The humans speak of internal evolution. What does this mean?" "We have evolved together as a galaxy for 3,000 years. Elena wished she could tell them the real reason. The truth was that humanity had been changing in ways that scared their leaders. Some humans were developing abilities that went beyond normal mental powers. They could sense thoughts across vast distances, see possible futures, and understand alien minds so completely that they sometimes forgot they were human. The government was afraid. They were afraid that humans might lose themselves completely if they kept working so closely with alien minds, so they had made the decision to pull back, to focus on what it meant to be human before they forgot entirely. "We need time to understand ourselves better," Elena said carefully. "For too long we have focused outward, helping others solve their problems. Now we must look inward." A creature that looked like a walking tree covered in golden leaves rustled with distress. The forest mines of Kepler 442b had been humanity's closest allies. "But who will help us understand the Thermal Lords when they speak of honor debts? Who will translate the quantum poetry of the energy dancers? Humans are the only species that can hold two opposite ideas in their minds at the same time." That was exactly the problem, Elena thought. Humans had become too good at holding alien ideas in their minds. Some of the diplomats who had worked in the chamber for decades had to be hospitalized because their brains couldn't handle thinking like 5 different species at once. Elena looked around the chamber one more time. She saw the panic in their alien faces, heard it in their strange voices. These beings had come to depend on humanity not just for translation, but for understanding itself. Without humans to bridge the gaps between them, how would the crystal people understand creatures made of gas? How would beings that thought in mathematics communicate with those that thought in music? "The decision has been made," Elena said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "All human diplomats and mediators will return to human space within the month. We will maintain trade relationships, but we will no longer participate in galactic government." The chamber erupted again. This time the noise was so loud and chaotic that Elena's translation device started sparking. The crystal people were flashing angry red now. The gas clouds were forming into storm shapes. The apex colonies were clicking so fast it sounded like machine gun fire. Ambassador Vex from the Silicon Mines, beings that were part computer and part crystal, projected his thoughts directly into the air as floating equations. Elena could read them because she had trained for years to understand mathematical language. The equations basically said, "This action will result in the probability of galactic war increasing by 700%. Elena knew he was probably right. In the 200 years since humans had taken over as the main mediators, there had been only 3 minor conflicts between species. Before humans arrived, the galaxy had been constantly at war. Different species simply couldn't understand each other well enough to avoid fighting. "Please reconsider," begged a voice like singing wind. It came from the energy dancers, beings made of pure light and electrical fields. "Without human mediators, the Trade Council will collapse within months. The peace accords will become meaningless. We will return to the dark times." Elena closed her eyes for a moment. She had been part of negotiating those peace accords 15 years ago. It had taken 3 years of constant meetings, with humans working around the clock to help 37 different species find common ground. The breakthrough had come when Elena realized that what the thermal lords called honor was the same thing the forest minds called root truth, even though they expressed it in completely different ways. "You will adapt," Elena said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "You will have to." She began walking toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Behind her, she could hear the other species trying to talk to each other without human help. Already it was going badly. The crystal people's light patterns were making the gas beings swirl in confusion. The mathematical projections from the silicon mines were causing the forest minds to rustle with distress. As Elena reached the door, she heard the first argument starting. The thermal lords were getting hotter, which made the ice spirits retreat to the far end of the chamber. The bug-like apex colonies were clicking in patterns that the hive minds apparently found insulting. Elena stepped onto her transport ship without looking back. Through the viewport, she watched the great chamber grow smaller as they flew away. The lights inside were flashing in chaotic patterns now. She could see her replacement diplomats from other species struggling to maintain order. As her ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying her away from everything she had worked for, Elena wondered if humanity was making the biggest mistake in galactic history. Behind them, in the great chamber where thousands of species had learned to work together, the first real crisis in 2 centuries was already beginning. The stars that had sung with the voices of a united galaxy were about to fall very quiet indeed. 6 months had passed since the last human diplomat left the Galactic Harmony Chamber, and Ambassador Keth was beginning to understand what fear felt like. His metal body, normally glowing a calm orange, had been burning white-hot for weeks. Around him, the great chamber that had once buzzed with the organized chaos of successful diplomacy now echoed with angry voices and confused silence. Today's disaster had started simply enough. The depths dwellers from the ocean world of Gliesa 667c wanted to trade their rare deep-sea minerals for the tree silk produced by the canopy builders of Wolf 359. It should have been easy. Both species had things the other needed. Both were peaceful. Both had been trading partners for over a century. But without humans to translate not just their words but their entire ways of thinking, everything had gone wrong. "Time flows differently in the deep places," gurgled Ambassador Reefsinger, his water-filled suit making his voice sound like he was drowning. "We measure worth by the slow grinding of stone, by the pressure of fathoms, by the patience of the eternal dark." The canopy builder representative, a being that looked like a walking flower garden, rustled her leaves in what Keth had learned was extreme frustration. "Your words are as murky as your water, deep dweller. We speak of seasons and growth cycles. Trade must happen when the silk pods ripen, not when your stones feel ready." Keth tried to help. The thermal lords had been trading with both species for decades, but he quickly realized that his own understanding had always depended on human translators explaining what everyone really meant. Without Elena and her team, he was lost. "Perhaps," Keth suggested, his voice crackling with heat stress, "we could establish a timeline that works for both of your species?" Both aliens turned to stare at him with what he was pretty sure was disgust. "Timeline?" Reefsinger's tentacles waved in patterns that Keth's translator said meant either deep thought or preparation for violence. "The thermal speaker thinks in straight lines. But truth flows in spirals like the great currents. How can we bind the spiral to the line? The canopy builder's flowers actually wilted, and you speak in water riddles that make no sense. My people need to know, will you deliver silk-weight minerals before the third blooming or not?" Keth felt his temperature rising dangerously. "Surely you can both just agree on a simple exchange rate and delivery schedule." The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that comes right before an explosion. Simple? Reefsinger's suit began to leak as his agitation grew. "There is nothing simple in the deep. Every grain of sand has a story spanning millions of years. Every mineral crystal holds the memory of pressure and time. How can we make simple what took eons to create? Time. The canopy builder's leaves burst into distressed patterns of red and gold. You speak of eons while our blooming season lasts only days. Your stories will outlive our great seedlings. We need answers now, not geological poetry. That's when Keth realized the horrible truth. Humans hadn't just translated languages. They had somehow translated entire ways of existing. The depths dwellers experienced time like a slow, deep river, where everything was connected to everything else across vast spans of years. The canopy builders lived in quick cycles of growth and renewal, where timing was everything and delays meant death. These two species didn't just speak different languages. They lived in completely different universes of meaning, and without humans to bridge that gap, they might as well have been trying to trade with creatures from different dimensions. The meeting ended with both species stalking out in opposite directions. Keth watched them go and felt something cold settle in his molten core. This was just one failed negotiation, but he had a feeling it was the beginning of something much worse. His fears proved correct over the following weeks. Across the galaxy, similar breakdowns were happening everywhere. The machine intelligences of the Forge worlds couldn't understand why the energy dancers cared about spiritual concerns when discussing mining rights. How could beings made of light and electricity have spiritual feelings about dead rock? The swarm minds, who thought as one collective consciousness, found individual-based species chaotic and unpredictable. Why did each member of the Crystal Singers have different opinions? Why couldn't they just agree on one position and stick to it? It made no sense to creatures who had never experienced individual thought. The Void Dancers, who communicated through tiny changes in gravitational fields, couldn't make themselves understood to anyone. Their language was so subtle that only humans had ever learned to sense it. Without human interpreters, the Void Dancers might as well have been mute. In the Harmony Chamber, the great AI systems that had managed galactic diplomacy for 3,000 years began to malfunction. The computers had been programmed to facilitate discussions between species with compatible thought patterns. But now they were encountering logical paradoxes that made their circuits spark and smoke. How could they process a trade agreement between species that didn't agree on what time meant? How could they mediate between beings who thought in colors and beings who thought in mathematics? The AIs had not been designed for this level of fundamental incompatibility. Emergency protocols activated, trying to maintain basic order. But the emergency systems had been designed by a committee of species working together. Without humans to coordinate that committee, even the emergency protocols began to contradict each other. Admiral Zexhai of the Thermal Lords reviewed the daily reports with growing alarm. Galactic trade was collapsing as species retreated to their home systems. The great shipping lanes that had connected thousands of worlds were going dark. Even the emergency communication networks were failing as different species stopped trying to talk to each other. The forest mines had sealed their borders after a catastrophic misunderstanding with the Hive Queens, something about nursery worlds and dangerous growth patterns. The silicon mines had gone completely silent 3 weeks ago. Their last message had been a complex mathematical equation that nobody could understand. It might have been a goodbye. It might have been a declaration of war. Without humans to translate mathematical poetry, there was no way to know. Zexhai looked at the star charts showing the galaxy's spiral arms. 3 months ago, those charts had been covered with the bright lines of trade routes and communication networks. Now vast sections were going dark as species after species chose isolation over the impossible task of trying to understand alien minds. The worst part was that everyone could see it happening. The galaxy was unraveling in real time and nobody knew how to stop it. The species that tried to work together ended up in bigger fights than the ones who just gave up and went home. In the deepest archives of the Harmony Chamber, ancient sensors detected movement at the edge of the galaxy. Something vast and hungry was stirring in the empty space between star systems. The Devourers, dormant for 3,000 years, were beginning to wake up. They could sense the discord spreading through the galaxy like blood in the water. And they were getting ready to feed, but nobody noticed the sensor readings. The beings who monitored the deep space networks had stopped talking to the beings who managed galactic security. And without humans to connect the dots between different types of intelligence, the most important warning in galactic history went unheard. The galaxy was falling apart. and the only species that could have held it together was nowhere to be found. 1 year after humanity's departure, Admiral Zexai stood in what used to be the busiest conference room in the galaxy. Now only 17 species still came to the Harmony Chamber, and even they could barely manage to stay in the same room together. The great crystal walls that had once glowed with the warm light of successful diplomacy now flickered with the harsh colors of constant conflict. Zexai's metal body burned with frustration as he reviewed the daily disaster reports. Galactic trade was down 89%. Diplomatic incidents had increased by 340%. 3 different species had declared eternal wars over what human diplomats would have recognized as simple misunderstandings. The worst incident had happened just 2 weeks ago. The Centaurian hive queens, who protected their young more fiercely than any species in the galaxy, had received a message from the Void Dancers. The translation computers had done their best, but without human oversight. They had gotten it completely wrong. The Void Dancers had been trying to say, "We dance in celebration of new life throughout the galaxy." But the computers had translated it as, "We dance to consume the new life in your nursery worlds." The hive queens had immediately sealed all their borders and declared the Void Dancers to be enemies of life itself. They had launched their entire war fleet before anyone could explain the mistake. The Void Dancers, who communicated through gravity waves, couldn't understand why they were suddenly being attacked. Their attempts to explain only made things worse because their language was so alien that the translation computers turned their peaceful messages into what sounded like threats. Now, the entire Centaurian Empire was at war with beings who had never hurt anyone in their million-year history, and there was no way to stop it, because nobody could properly translate between species that lived in completely different realities. Zexai looked around the nearly empty chamber, where thousands of delegates had once worked together. Only a desperate few remained. The crystal people still came, but they spent most of their time glowing confused colors. The forest mines sent representatives, but their tree-like delegates just stood in corners rustling with distress. Even the silicon mines had stopped attending after their mathematical language started causing the other species physical pain. "We must do something," said Queen Zara of the hive mines, her voice buzzing with desperation. "Every day we delay, more connections are severed. Soon there will be no galactic civilization left to save." Ambassador Veth from the Crystal Singers pulsed with anxious blue light. "My people have been working with the Thermal Lords to create artificial human mediators. We have collected genetic samples from the years when humans lived among us. Perhaps we can recreate their unique abilities." Zexai felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. "What progress have you made?" "We have successfully created beings that look human," Veth admitted, his light dimming. "But they lack something essential. They can speak our languages, but they cannot understand our souls. When we show them our color songs, they see only pretty lights. When the Thermal Lords speak of honor fire, these artificial humans hear only words about temperature." The project had been their greatest hope, and it was failing. The artificial humans could process information and translate languages, but they couldn't bridge the impossible gaps between alien ways of thinking. They were like perfect copies of human bodies with none of the mystery that had made real humans so special. Dr. Kesahai, one of the Crystal Singers' greatest scientists, had been studying the problem for months. "We have concluded that human mediation abilities were not simply genetic. They involve something deeper, something we cannot recreate. Perhaps it was their neural structure, or their evolutionary history, or something even more fundamental about how human consciousness works." Queen Zara buzzed with frustration. "Then we are doomed. Without the humans, we cannot understand each other. Without understanding, we cannot work together. Without cooperation, we will destroy ourselves just as we did in the ancient times." That was the thing that terrified everyone. Before humans had arrived to serve as galactic mediators, the galaxy had been a dark and violent place. Different species had fought constant wars because they literally could not understand each other well enough to make peace. Entire civilizations had been wiped out over misunderstandings that humans would have cleared up in minutes. Zexai pulled up a holographic display showing the current state of galactic civilization. Red zones marked areas of active conflict. Yellow zones showed regions where communication had broken down, but violence hadn't started yet. Green zones indicated places where species were still trying to work together. The display was mostly red and yellow now. The green zones were shrinking every day. "Look at Sector 7, Zexai said, highlighting an area near the galactic core. The ice spirits and the flame walkers have been perfect neighbors for 2 centuries. Now they're building weapons because they can't understand each other's territorial signals. The ice spirits think the flame walkers are planning to melt their worlds. The flame walkers think the ice spirits are trying to freeze their stars. In Sector 12, Queen Zara added, the Trade Federation has collapsed completely. 17 species that used to share resources freely now hoard everything for themselves. They're afraid to trade because they can't tell the difference between a fair deal and a trap. The silence that followed was broken by an urgent alarm. Emergency signals were coming in from the long-range sensor networks at the galaxy's edge. Sci-Fi activated the display, and what he saw made his metal body go cold despite its internal fire. Impossible, he whispered. On the screen, massive dark shapes were moving between the stars. They were too big to be ships, too organized to be natural phenomena. The sensor readings showed energy signatures that hadn't been detected for 3,000 years. The Devourers, Queen Zara's voice was barely a whisper. They're waking up. Every species in the galaxy knew the stories. The Devourers were ancient creatures that lived in the empty space between galaxies. They fed on conflict and chaos, growing stronger wherever intelligent life fought and suffered. 3,000 years ago, when the galaxy had finally achieved peace through human mediation, the Devourers had gone dormant. But now the galaxy was at war with itself again. And that conflict was calling them home. How many? Sci-Fi asked, though he dreaded the answer. Sensors show at least 50 major entities, reported the chamber's AI in a voice crackling with interference. Estimated time to reach the outer rim, 6 months. Estimated time to reach the galactic core, 2 years, 2 years. That was how long they had to somehow fix the mess they had created. They needed to restore galactic cooperation, rebuild the communication networks, and unite hundreds of species that currently couldn't stand to be in the same star system, and they had to do it all without the only species that had ever been able to make such cooperation possible. Send emergency signals to all species, Sci-Fi ordered. Tell them about the Devourer threat. Surely the danger of extinction will force them to work together. But even as he gave the order, he knew it was hopeless. How could they convince species to unite when those same species couldn't even understand the warnings? How could beings that thought in mathematics cooperate with beings that thought in music? How could creatures that experienced time as a river work with creatures that experienced it as a series of separate moments? The humans had made it look so easy. For 200 years they had woven the galaxy together with invisible threads of understanding. Now those threads were broken, and nobody knew how to repair them. The Devourers were coming, drawn by the chaos of a galaxy that had forgotten how to speak to itself, and the only hope for survival was nowhere to be found. Dr. Sarah Chen floated in the zero gravity of the archive chamber aboard the generation ship New Horizon, surrounded by data crystals that contained 50,000 years of human history. Most of the records were routine: birth certificates, trade agreements, exploration logs. But buried deep in the classified sections, she had found something that changed everything. Sarah was part of the 3rd generation born since humanity's exodus from galactic space. She had never seen an alien in person, never stood in the Great Harmony Chamber, never experienced the thrill of bridging impossible gaps between species that shouldn't have been able to communicate at all. But she had grown up hearing stories, and those stories had always bothered her. Why were humans so uniquely good at understanding alien minds? Other species were just as intelligent, just as curious, just as capable of learning. The Crystal Singers had developed mathematics that could describe 11 dimensions. The Silicon Mines could process information faster than any computer. The Energy Dancers could manipulate matter at the quantum level. Yet none of them could do what humans did naturally: understand each other. The answer was hidden in a research file from 2157, buried under 7 layers of security clearance. Dr. Marcus Webb, head of the First Contact Research Division, had discovered something that the government had immediately classified as the highest possible secret. Sarah read the report 3 times before she truly believed what she was seeing. Archaeological analysis of the Kenyan excavation site has revealed artifacts that predate known human civilization by approximately 47,000 years. The artifacts show clear signs of non-human technology, specifically matching the quantum resonance patterns we've detected in harmony chamber construction techniques. Her hands shook as she opened the next file, Photos of crystal formations that looked exactly like the technology used by the Galactic Council. Dating tests that confirmed their impossible age. And buried at the bottom of the report, a conclusion that had been sealed for over a century. Evidence suggests that Earth was visited during the late Paleolithic period by an advanced species. Genetic analysis of human remains from this era shows unusual mutations in brain structure, specifically in areas associated with empathy and pattern recognition. These mutations appear to have been deliberately introduced and then spread through the human population over thousands of years. Sarah's heart pounded as she accessed the next level of classified files. The evidence was overwhelming. 50,000 years ago, humanity had been on the brink of extinction. The Ice Age had divided human tribes into isolated groups that couldn't communicate with each other. They had developed completely different languages, belief systems, and ways of understanding the world. And then something had changed. Archaeological sites from around the world showed the same pattern. Sudden improvements in human cooperation, languages that began to share common roots, art that showed humans working together despite obvious cultural differences, all of it happening at exactly the same time as if guided by some external force. The architects. That's what Dr. Webb had called them in his secret reports. The same species that had built the Harmony Chamber, that had established the galactic communication networks, that had created the technology that allowed thousands of alien species to work together. But Sarah found something that Dr. Webb had missed, hidden in genetic data that hadn't been properly analyzed until now. The mutations the architects had introduced weren't random. They were specifically designed to create minds that could hold contradictory concepts simultaneously, that could empathize with completely alien forms of consciousness, that could bridge gaps between incompatible ways of thinking. The architects had turned humanity into the ultimate translators, not just of language, but of consciousness itself. Sarah pulled up the final classified file, and what she found there made her stomach drop. It was a message encoded in human DNA itself that had only been discovered 5 years ago when genetic scanning technology became advanced enough to read it. The message was simple and terrifying. When the galaxy achieves stability through mediation, the mediators must withdraw. Only through struggle can species evolve beyond their need for intermediaries. This is the test. Pass and join the greater community. Fail and begin again. Sarah stared at the screen in horror. Humanity's exodus wasn't a choice their leaders had made. It was programming that had been built into their very genes. The architects had designed humans to eventually abandon their role as galactic mediators, forcing the other species to evolve or die. But the test was failing catastrophically. Instead of evolving beyond their need for human mediation, the galaxy was tearing itself apart. Species that had worked together for centuries couldn't even remember how to have a simple conversation. Without human help, Sarah quickly accessed the emergency communication networks and began broadcasting her discovery to the human Exodus fleet. If she was right, humanity's withdrawal wasn't just causing a diplomatic crisis. It was triggering an evolutionary test that could destroy galactic civilization entirely. The response came within hours. Admiral Marcus Webb, descendant of the scientist who had first discovered the truth, contacted her directly. Dr. Chen, his voice crackled over the long-range communication link. Your findings confirm what our deep space sensors have been telling us. The Devourers are moving toward the galactic core. They're drawn to the chaos we've left behind. Sarah felt cold despite the warmth of the ship around her. Admiral, do you think the architects planned this too? Did they create the Devourers as part of the test? We don't know, Webb admitted. But what we do know is that we have a choice to make. Our genetic programming tells us to stay away, to let the galaxy find its own path. But our conscience tells us that billions of innocent beings are about to die because of a test they never asked to take. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about the stories she had grown up hearing. Tales of humans working miracles of diplomacy, bringing peace to species that had been enemies for millennia, creating understanding where there should have been only confusion and conflict. What are our options? She asked. That's what we're debating now, Webb said. Some believe we should honor our programming and let the test continue no matter the cost. Others want to return immediately and resume our role as mediators. But there's a third option that's being discussed. What's that? We go back not as mediators but as teachers. Instead of doing the work for them, We help the other species develop the abilities they need to understand each other on their own. It would take longer, and it would be much more difficult. But it might be the only way to pass the architect's test while saving galactic civilization. Sarah thought about the crystal singers trying to create artificial humans, missing the essential spark that made human mediation possible. She thought about the forest minds and the thermal lords, struggling to understand each other's basic concepts. She thought about the devourers moving through space like a dark tide, feeding on the discord that humanity's absence had created. "How long do we have?" she asked. "According to our calculations, the devourers will reach the galactic core in 18 months, Webb said. "If we're going to act, we need to decide soon." Sarah looked around the archive chamber one more time. 50,000 years of human history surrounded her, including the secret that had shaped their entire species. The architects had made humanity into bridges between alien minds, but they had also programmed them to eventually burn those bridges. Now humanity faced the ultimate test of their own evolution. Would they follow their genetic programming and watch the galaxy destroy itself? Would they return to their old role and keep the other species dependent forever? Or would they find a third way, one that honored both their nature as mediators and their responsibility to help others grow? The fate of trillions of beings hung in the balance, and the decision would have to be made by the species that had never asked to be special in the first place. Admiral Marcus Webb stood before the holographic display showing the positions of 300 human ships scattered across the edge of the galaxy. Each ship represented thousands of people who had left everything behind when humanity abandoned galactic space. Now he was asking them to make an even harder choice: return to save a galaxy that might be better off learning to save itself. The debate had been raging for weeks. Dr. Sarah Chen's discovery about the architects had split humanity into 3 factions, each convinced they knew the right path forward. The purists, led by Dr. Elena Vasquez herself, argued that returning would doom all species to eternal dependence. "We are programmed to withdraw for a reason," Elena insisted during the ship-to-ship conferences. "If we go back now, the other species will never learn to communicate without us. We'll trap them in permanent childhood while we play the role of galactic parents forever." The interventionists, commanded by Captain Sarah Mitchell of the Determination, believed that letting billions die for an abstract principle was monstrous. "The architects aren't here to explain their test," Mitchell had argued. "Maybe they were wrong. Maybe their plan was flawed from the beginning. All I know is that real people are dying while we debate philosophy." But it was the third faction, the evolutionists, who offered the most radical solution. Led by Dr. Chen and supported by Admiral Webb, they proposed returning not as mediators but as teachers. "We don't just do the work for them," Chen explained during the final debate. "We teach them how to do it themselves. We show them the mental techniques that allow humans to understand alien minds. We help them develop the cognitive flexibility that we take for granted." Elena's image flickered with static as her ship moved further from the galaxy. "And what if they can't learn? What if their brains simply aren't capable of the same kind of empathy that makes human mediation possible? Then we'll have to find other ways," Webb said firmly. "But we won't know until we try. And right now, not trying means watching galactic civilization collapse." The vote was close. 51% in favor of the evolutionist approach. As the human fleet began its journey back toward galactic space, Webb couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to attempt something that had never been tried before in galactic history. The first challenge came from the galaxy itself. When human ships appeared at the borders of former ally species, they were met with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. The Crystal Singers refused to allow humans into their territory, believing it was some kind of trick. The forest minds welcomed them, but wanted them to immediately resume their old role as mediators. "You don't understand," Dr. Chen explained to Queen Zara of the hive minds during their first meeting in over a year. "We're not here to solve your problems for you. We're here to teach you how to solve them yourselves." Queen Zara's buzzing took on an angry tone. "The galaxy is falling apart. The Devourers are only months away from the outer rim. This is not the time for teaching lessons." But Chen was patient. She had studied the human mediation techniques and broken them down into learnable skills. "Let me show you something," she said, bringing up a holographic display of 2 completely different brain scans. "This is how a human brain works when trying to understand an alien concept. Notice how multiple areas light up simultaneously, including regions that normally shouldn't be connected. She switched to another image. This is how your brain works when trying to understand the same concept. You're using only the logical processing centers, but understanding alien minds isn't just about logic. It's about empathy, imagination, and the ability to hold contradictory ideas without rejecting them. Queen Zara studied the displays with growing interest. You're saying we can learn to think more like humans? Not exactly like humans, Chen corrected, but you can learn to expand your cognitive flexibility. Watch. Chen brought up a communication from the thermal lords that had been causing confusion for months. To the hive minds, it sounded like an aggressive challenge. To humans, it was clearly a formal invitation to discuss trade agreements. The key is understanding that the thermal lords express respect through apparent conflict, Chen explained. In their culture, being invited to argue means being treated as an equal. When they say your trade proposals burn like weak flames, they're actually saying we respect you enough to engage in serious negotiations. Queen Zara's buzzing changed to a tone of amazement. I can see it now. The pattern makes sense when viewed from their cultural perspective. It was a small breakthrough, but it gave Chen hope. If the hive minds could learn to understand the thermal lords, maybe other species could learn to understand each other too. The teaching process was painfully slow. Each species had to learn not just new concepts, but entirely new ways of thinking. The crystal singers had to develop empathy centers in their crystalline minds. The silicon minds had to learn that not everything could be reduced to mathematical equations. The energy dancers had to find ways to express their gravity-based language in forms that solid beings could understand. Some species adapted quickly. The forest minds, with their deep connection to growth and change, embraced the challenge of expanding their consciousness. Within weeks, they were successfully communicating with the gas cloud collectives using techniques that human teachers had shown them. Others struggled. The void dancers had spent millions of years communicating only through gravitational fields so subtle that most species couldn't even detect them. Learning to express their thoughts in ways that other beings could understand was like asking humans to communicate by changing the color of their blood. But progress was being made. Dr. Chen watched with pride as a group of crystal singers successfully mediated a dispute between the ice spirits and the flame walkers. The crystal beings had learned to translate between temperature-based emotions and cold logic concepts, bridging a gap that had seemed impossible just months before. Meanwhile, the Devourers continued their advance toward the galactic core. Long-range sensors showed them consuming empty star systems, growing larger and more powerful as they fed on the cosmic radiation left behind by collapsed civilizations. Admiral Webb coordinated the galaxy's defense from the rebuilt Harmony Chamber. But this time the coordination looked different. Instead of humans making all the important decisions, each species contributed their unique abilities to the common effort. The silicon minds calculated optimal fleet positions using mathematics that hurt human brains to contemplate. The energy dancers scouted ahead using forms of faster-than-light travel that nobody else understood. The crystal singers created communication networks that allowed instant coordination across the entire galaxy. And the humans? They served as teachers, coaches, and guides, helping each species understand what the others were contributing to the common cause. The final battle took place at the edge of the galactic core, where the Devourers met a united fleet representing every major species in the galaxy. But the victory didn't come from superior weapons or tactics. It came from something the galaxy had never achieved before: perfect coordination between radically different forms of consciousness. When the crystal singers sang their battle hymns in frequencies of light, the energy dancers translated them into gravitational waves that the void dancers could amplify. When the silicon minds calculated the optimal moment to strike, the forest minds felt it as a stirring in their deepest roots and passed the information to species that thought in sense and chemical signals. The Devourers, creatures that fed on discord and chaos, found themselves facing something they had never encountered: harmony so perfect that it created no food for them at all. Faced with starvation, they simply faded away, returning to the empty spaces between galaxies to wait for the next cycle of galactic discord. In the aftermath, as the United Fleet celebrated their victory, Admiral Webb stood in the Harmony Chamber and watched something he had never thought he would see. The chamber was full of alien delegates again, but this time they didn't need human translators. They had learned to understand each other directly. The crystal singers glowed with colors that the gas clouds could read like poetry. The forest minds rustled in patterns that the hive minds felt in their collective consciousness. The thermal lords spoke of honor in ways that the ice spirits could understand and respect. Humanity had returned to galactic space, but not as indispensable mediators. They were teachers, partners, and friends in an ongoing experiment in consciousness expansion. The galaxy had learned to communicate not despite its differences, but because of them. Dr. Chen stood beside Admiral Webb, watching the impossible sight of hundreds of alien species working together, without human mediation. "Do you think the architects would be proud?" she asked. Webb smiled. "I think they would be amazed. We didn't just pass their test. We created something better than what they had planned." When humanity had departed the chamber, the stars had fallen quiet. When they returned, the galaxy had learned to sing new songs that no single species could have composed alone. And in the vast silence between galaxies, even the devourers listened to the music and knew that something fundamental had changed. The age of mediation was over. The age of true understanding had begun.